The automatic glass doors whooshed open as Darren Brown stepped inside the building lobby. It was his first official day back at the property, not as a visitor, but as its new owner. He was dressed in a simple navy hoodie, jeans, and sneakers, his face calm, as if he were just another person passing through. A thin drizzle outside had dampened his clothes slightly, adding to the impression that he might have been running errands rather than preparing for a high-stakes business meeting. He barely made it 3 steps in before the security guard's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Hey, buddy, hold up." Darren paused and turned to see a broad-shouldered man behind the security desk. His badge read Mike K., security lead. The man looked him over slowly, one eyebrow raised. It wasn't just a glance, it was an evaluation, and the result wasn't flattering. "You got an appointment, or?" Mike's tone was heavy with condescension. "Yes, I do." Darren kept his voice polite. He knew exactly where this was headed. Mike folded his arms across his chest, smirking. "Right? And where exactly do you think you're going?" Darren gave a small smile, the kind you offer when you know something the other person doesn't. "I have a meeting upstairs with the building management." Mike let out a low chuckle, the kind that makes a person feel 2 inches tall. "Ah, you sure about that, champ? Because people don't just wander into this place looking like that." His eyes flicked to Darren's casual clothes, a clear signal that, in his mind, Darren didn't belong here. Darren kept his hands in his pockets, still calm. "I'm exactly where I need to be. Could you call Sheila, please? She's expecting me." The guard leaned back in his chair with a sigh, as if Darren were a child asking to play where he wasn't allowed. "Listen, man," Mike said with a patronizing grin. "This isn't some shopping mall where anyone can stroll in. You can't just say you have a meeting and expect me to believe you." Darren tilted his head slightly, watching as 2 other people, both sharply dressed in business attire, entered through the same doors. Mike barely glanced at them before giving a polite nod. They sailed through the lobby without a word. Darren saw the double standard play out right in front of him, but he didn't flinch. "Didn't ask them any questions, did you?" Darren remarked quietly. Mike's jaw tightened. "What's that supposed to mean?" Darren kept his tone neutral. "Just making an observation." Mike's expression darkened, sensing a challenge. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk, now fully invested in making Darren feel out of place. "Look, pal, I don't know what kind of scam you're trying to pull here, but it's not going to work. Why don't you do us both a favor and take a hike, yeah?" Darren remained unfazed, his calm demeanor only irritating Mike further. "I'm not leaving. Sheila will clear this up as soon as you call her." Mike let out a scoff. "Buddy, you think I'm stupid? I've seen guys like you before. Always trying to sneak their way in, delivery drivers, door-to-door salespeople, freeloaders. And they all think they've got some excuse." He chuckled. "But guess what? Not today." Darren's lips curled slightly, as if suppressing a deeper thought. "You're right about one thing," he said, meeting Mike's eyes with quiet confidence. "I'm not like those other guys." The comment only made Mike more defensive. "Oh yeah? And what makes you so special?" Darren could see the insecurity behind the bravado, the need to assert control over the little patch of authority Mike had carved out for himself. He didn't take the bait. Instead, he gestured toward the phone on the desk. "All I need is for you to make the call," Darren said. "That's it. Simple." Mike snorted, crossing his arms again. "And what if I don't?" Darren sighed softly, a flicker of disappointment crossing his face, as if Mike had just confirmed everything Darren had suspected. "Then we'll both be wasting time, and that's not going to look good for anyone." Mike's smirk faltered for the briefest moment, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "I've got rules to follow, buddy. And one of those rules is not letting random guys wander around the building like they own the place." He laughed under his breath. "Unless you've got some kind of badge I don't know about." Before Darren could respond, the elevator doors chimed open, and Sheila, the building manager, stepped out into the lobby. She was a sharp, professional woman in her early 40s, wearing a tailored suit and carrying a folder under one arm. "Mike," she called, a warm smile spreading across her face when she saw Darren. "There you are. I was wondering if you'd arrived yet." Mike blinked, visibly confused. "Wait, you know this guy?" Sheila gave him an odd look, as if the question were absurd. "Of course I know him. He's Darren Brown." She gestured toward Darren, now realizing the awkwardness in the air. the new owner of the building. The color drained from Mike's face. You're kidding, right? Darren gave him the same small smile he'd been wearing since the beginning. Nope. Sheila's brows knit together as she looked between them. What's going on here? Why was Mr. Brown held up? Mike stumbled over his words, scrambling to save face. I didn't know. It didn't look I was just following protocol, okay? You thought I didn't look the part. Darren finished for him, his voice still maddeningly calm. Mike opened his mouth to argue, but then closed it, realizing there was no point. The shame was already settling in, heavy and undeniable. I didn't mean anything by it, Mike muttered, his tone defensive but weaker now. It's just, you know how it is. Gotta be careful. Darren's gaze was steady, unflinching. It's not about being careful. It's about treating people fairly. That's what you missed. Mike swallowed hard, his bravado evaporating under the weight of Darren's words. Sheila shot him a disappointed glance before turning back to Darren with an apologetic smile. I'm so sorry about this, Mr. Brown, she said. Let's head upstairs. The team's waiting for you. Darren gave a small nod, but before following Sheila, he turned back to Mike. No hard feelings, Darren said softly, though his words carried an edge of finality. Just something to think about. Mike gave a stiff nod, too embarrassed to meet Darren's eyes. As the elevator doors closed behind Darren and Sheila, Mike sat down heavily at his desk, the weight of his mistake pressing down like a stone. Darren knew that the day was only beginning, and that the real work was still ahead. But as the elevator ascended, a subtle smile played on his lips. This was exactly how he wanted it to start. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding, and Darren stepped out into a sleek, modern conference room on the top floor. Sheila trailed just behind him, visibly flustered, trying to smooth over the awkwardness of what had just happened downstairs. I really apologize for that, Mr. Brown, she said, her voice careful and professional. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again. Darren gave her a polite smile, but his eyes carried a deeper meaning. We'll make sure it doesn't happen again, he said evenly. Sheila's shoulders stiffened slightly. She knew exactly what he was implying. This wasn't just about the incident with Mike. It was about a systemic issue, a pattern Darren had already noticed in the building. And it wasn't going to be solved with a quick apology. The rest of the executive team was already seated at the long, polished table, murmuring among themselves as Darren entered. Their chatter ceased the moment they saw him, replaced by warm, professional greetings. Darren, one of the board members, Peter, stood and extended a hand. Glad you could make it. We've been looking forward to this meeting. Darren accepted the handshake with the same composed expression he'd worn all morning. Likewise, he said, taking a seat at the head of the table. As Sheila moved toward her place at the far end of the room, Darren noticed the subtle glances being exchanged between the executives. It was the same kind of glance he'd seen countless times before, when people felt the sudden need to evaluate someone to figure out if they were dealing with a threat, an ally, or something in between. But Darren had no intention of making it easy for them. I'd like to start today's meeting with a slight change to the agenda, he announced, leaning back in his chair with an air of quiet authority. Before we get into the financials and logistics, I want to discuss an observation I've made during my visits to this building. The executives exchanged puzzled looks, and Sheila shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Your visits? Peter asked, clearly confused. I wasn't aware you'd been here before today. Darren allowed a brief, knowing smile to surface. That's because you didn't know it was me. The room went still. Every pair of eyes was now fixed on Darren, waiting for him to explain. He let the silence hang for a moment, just long enough to make them realize that whatever he was about to say wasn't going to be trivial. For the past few months, I've made several visits to this building, Darren continued, his tone measured. Sometimes as a delivery driver, sometimes just as a casual visitor. I made sure not to stand out, not to draw attention. I wanted to observe how this building really operates, how people treat each other when they don't think anyone important is watching. Peter shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. And what exactly did you observe? Darren's gaze was steady as he answered. I observed two things. First, there are some great people working here. People who treat everyone with kindness, whether they're colleagues, clients, or strangers. And those are the people we need to promote and build this business around. He paused, letting that compliment settle before delivering the next part. But I also saw a lot of selective behavior. I saw people who were polite to executives but dismissive toward delivery drivers. People who cut corners when they thought no one was looking. And of course, we all witnessed a bit of that downstairs with Mike this morning. Sheila closed her eyes briefly, as if bracing for the fallout. Peter coughed awkwardly, trying to downplay the situation. I'm sure Mike didn't mean anything by it. These things happen, people get busy, stressed. Darren cut him off with a raised hand. It's not about stress, Peter. It's about culture. It's about the way we subconsciously decide who's worth our time and who isn't. The room was silent again, but this time it wasn't the kind of silence that came from politeness. It was the heavy, uncomfortable silence of people realizing they'd been called out. Sheila cleared her throat, her voice careful. What do you suggest, Mr. Brown? Darren leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table. We start with accountability. I want everyone in this building, from the top executives to the security guards, trained on inclusion, unconscious bias, and respect. I want to make it clear that we don't just follow protocol here. We treat every person who walks through those doors with dignity. Peter frowned, clearly skeptical. Inclusion training? Is that really necessary? We're a business, Darren, not a social experiment. Darren's gaze sharpened, but he didn't raise his voice. It's not a social experiment, Peter. It's good business, and it's non-negotiable. Peter opened his mouth to argue, but quickly shut it when he saw the look in Darren's eyes. There was no room for debate. Darren turned to Sheila. I'd like you to take the lead on this. Work with HR to put together a training program that's thorough and meaningful, not just a one-hour seminar to check a box. Sheila nodded slowly, still absorbing the shift in dynamics. Understood. Darren looked around the table, making sure each person felt the weight of what he was saying. We're not just acquiring a building here. We're building a culture, and that culture starts with how we treat people, whether they're executives or delivery drivers, whether they're dressed in a suit or a hoodie. He let the words hang in the air, allowing them to settle deeply into the room. After a long pause, Peter finally broke the silence with a sigh of resignation. All right, if that's how you want to play it, Darren, we'll follow your lead. Darren gave him a small, polite nod. Good, because this isn't just about following my lead. It's about doing what's right. The meeting continued, shifting into discussions of finances and operational plans, but the tone in the room had changed. The executives were no longer just sitting through another business pitch. They were being asked to rethink the way they operated on a fundamental level. And Darren knew that wasn't going to be easy, but he also knew it was necessary. When the meeting finally adjourned, Sheila walked Darren to the elevator. Do you really think it'll work? She asked quietly as they waited for the doors to open. Darren smiled, the same calm, deliberate smile he'd worn all day. It already is. The elevator doors slid open, and Darren stepped inside, leaving Sheila with a lingering sense that things were about to change, and not just in the way they had expected. The days following Darren's meeting with the executives passed quietly, but not without tension. His instructions for the inclusion training had been set in motion, and whispers began to spread among the building staff. Some employees welcomed the change, but others viewed it as an inconvenience, a bureaucratic annoyance pushed by a new owner trying to make a point. Mike, however, was taking it the hardest. At the front desk, his usual swagger had dulled into unease. The humiliation from that morning still haunted him, and the sting of Darren's calm but cutting remarks lingered in his mind. Darren hadn't raised his voice, hadn't demanded Mike's termination, but that almost made it worse. The man's composure had made Mike feel small, exposed. Every time the elevator chimed open, Mike braced himself for Darren to step out, watching him with that same unervingly calm expression. But Darren didn't hover. Days passed, and Darren remained out of sight, leaving Mike alone with the weight of his own thoughts. Then a memo arrived. Mandatory training announcement. Inclusion and cultural sensitivity workshops. All staff are required to attend a 3-part workshop beginning next Monday. Participation is non-negotiable, with each session focused on practical exercises, role-playing scenarios, and reflections on unconscious bias in the workplace. The reactions were immediate. I can't believe we're doing this, one of the other guards muttered as Mike scanned the memo. All because the new boss got treated a little rough? It's not like he was hurt. Mike said nothing, but the words gnawed at him. Part of him wanted to agree. After all, he'd just been doing his job, right? But another part of him, a smaller, quieter voice, knew the truth. Darren had been right. It wasn't about protocol. It was about the way he judged a man without knowing a thing about him. And the worst part? That man had been watching him the whole time. The following week, the first training session took place in a modest conference room on the second floor. Mike arrived early, hoping to sit in the back and blend into the crowd. But when he walked in, the first person he saw was Darren. Seated casually at the front of the room, Darren looked up and gave Mike a polite nod. "Morning, Mike." Mike's stomach flipped. He managed a stiff nod in return, unsure of whether it was better to sit far away from Darren or act normal. In the end, he chose a seat in the middle, close enough to look engaged, but not so close that it felt forced. More staff trickled in, filling the room with nervous energy. A facilitator from HR began the session with a brief introduction, explaining that the workshop was designed to promote fairness, respect, and self-awareness in the workplace. "We all have biases," the facilitator said with a warm, non-judgmental smile. "The point isn't to pretend we don't. It's to learn how to recognize them and prevent them from shaping how we treat others." Mike crossed his arms, his skepticism rising. This sounded like fluff. Another corporate gimmick, the kind of thing that looks good on paper but doesn't really change anything. But then Darren stood up. "I know some of you might be wondering why we're here," Darren said, his voice calm but direct. "And I get it. It's easy to see this as a chore, just another task on your to-do list. But this isn't just about checking a box. It's about something bigger." He paused, scanning the room, making eye contact with each person as if he wanted them to feel the full weight of his words. "Let me tell you a little story," Darren continued. "A few months ago, I visited this building for the first time. No one knew who I was. I wore a delivery uniform and brought in a package. I didn't say much, just watched. And you know what I saw? The room was dead silent. Even Mike found himself leaning in slightly, drawn in despite himself. I saw that the people who looked important got smiles, handshakes, and respect. And the people who didn't? They got ignored, questioned, or rushed along." Darren's tone remained gentle, but the message was sharp. It was clear that how you're treated here depends on who people think you are. And that's not the kind of culture I want to build. He let the words sink in, giving everyone time to absorb the implications. You might think, so what? Isn't that just how the world works? Maybe, but it doesn't have to be. We have a choice in how we treat people, whether we treat them as equals or as less than based on nothing more than a first impression. Mike shifted in his seat, the words hitting closer to home than he wanted to admit. "And here's the thing," Darren said, his gaze landing squarely on Mike for a brief second before moving on. "I'm not just talking about what happens in this building. I'm talking about what happens everywhere. How we interact with the delivery drivers, the cashiers, the janitors. The people we think don't matter because they're not wearing a suit or sitting at the head of a conference table." He paused again, letting the silence do some of the heavy lifting. "Change starts with small actions," Darren said quietly. "It starts with recognizing the moments when we make someone feel small and choosing to do better." The facilitator took over again, guiding the group through a series of exercises that forced them to confront their biases head-on. They role-played different scenarios, swapped stories about moments they had felt judged or overlooked, and reflected on the power dynamics at play in everyday interactions. By the end of the session, the room felt different, lighter, but also more serious. As the group began to disperse, Mike lingered, unsure whether to stay or leave. Darren was gathering his things at the front of the room when Mike finally approached, clearing his throat awkwardly. "Hey, Darren?" Mike said, his voice lower than usual. Darren looked up, his expression calm and unreadable. "What's up, Mike?" Mike scratched the back of his neck, struggling to find the right words. "Look, I just wanted to say I get it now. What you said about those small moments, I didn't think about it like that before. But you're right." Darren studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "That's good to hear, Mike." Mike hesitated, then added, "I'll do better." Darren smiled, a real, genuine smile this time. I believe you will. And just like that, the tension between them lifted, replaced by something more important, the beginning of understanding. As Mike walked away, Darren packed up the last of his things, satisfied. He knew this was only the first step, but it was a good one. The real change, he thought, wasn't going to come from memos or policies. It was going to come from people. And that was exactly what he had planned all along. Over the next few weeks, subtle but meaningful shifts began to ripple through the building. The training sessions were in full swing, and Darren's influence was quietly taking root. Employees were slowly starting to approach their jobs and each other with a new awareness. The polite but distant smiles of before were being replaced with genuine engagement. People began greeting the janitors by name. Delivery drivers were no longer waved off dismissively, and even the front desk staff, including Mike, softened their tone with visitors. But not everything was smooth sailing. Resistance lingered beneath the surface, and for some, the changes felt like an unnecessary burden. For others, the discomfort came from realizing how deeply ingrained certain habits and biases had become. Mike, however, was struggling more than most. The training had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself, truths he wasn't ready to fully accept. He tried to adjust, but every polite interaction felt stiff and forced, as if he were playing a role he didn't quite believe in. Worse, Darren's presence loomed over everything. Even when Darren wasn't physically in the building, Mike felt like the man's quiet judgment was everywhere, watching. That morning, Mike arrived at work feeling drained. He'd barely slept, haunted by thoughts that he was being judged not just by Darren, but by everyone. Was he really capable of changing? Or was he just faking it to keep his job? At the start of his shift, Sheila approached the front desk with a clipboard in hand, her expression neutral but professional. "Mike, can I have a word with you?" Mike tensed. Sure. What's up?" Sheila leaned on the counter, glancing briefly at the visitor log before meeting his gaze. "I just wanted to check in. How are things going? How are you adjusting?" Mike shrugged, trying to sound casual. "It's fine, I guess. Just doing my best, you know?" Sheila studied him, clearly sensing the discomfort beneath his words. "Look, Mike, I know this isn't easy for you, but this isn't about playing by new rules or faking your way through interactions. It's about understanding the why behind it." Mike exhaled slowly, struggling to hold back his frustration. "Yeah, but it feels like, I don't know, like I can't win. No matter what I do, it's not enough." Sheila's expression softened. "It's not about being perfect, Mike. It's about showing effort and making progress. Darren doesn't expect instant change. None of us do." He scratched the back of his neck, avoiding her gaze. "Yeah, well, it feels like every little mistake is being measured." "That's only because you're measuring it yourself," Sheila said gently. "Darren isn't out to get you, Mike. He just wants us all to do better. And that includes giving each other the space to grow." Later that day, Darren made an unannounced visit to the lobby. He strolled in, dressed in the same low-key manner he always did, jeans, sneakers, and a gray sweatshirt. The difference now was that Mike didn't flinch when he saw him. "Hey, Darren," Mike greeted, forcing a smile. "How's it going?" Darren returned the smile with ease. "Not bad, Mike. How about you? Holding up okay?" Mike shifted on his feet, feeling oddly self-conscious. "Yeah, just trying to get used to all this." Darren nodded thoughtfully. "It takes time. Change always does." Mike hesitated, then decided to be honest. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why do you care so much?" Mike's voice was low, as if the question had been weighing on him for a while. "I mean, you could have just bought the building, replaced some of us, and moved on. Why go through all this effort?" Darren leaned against the counter, his expression calm but serious. "Because it matters, Mike. The way we treat people, especially when we think no one's watching, says a lot about who we are. And I'm not just here to run a business. I'm here to build something better." Mike nodded slowly, absorbing Darren's words. It wasn't the answer he'd expected, but it hit him harder than he cared to admit. "I screwed up that first day," Mike admitted quietly. "I judged you without even thinking." Darren smiled gently, as if to say, "I know. The important thing is that you see it now, and you're doing the work to change. That's all I can ask for." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight between them lifting just slightly. Later that afternoon, Sheila and Darren met in the conference room to discuss the progress of the training sessions. Sheila placed a stack of reports on the table, her expression carefully neutral. "I think we're making progress," she said, though her tone suggested there were still challenges. "But not everyone is on board yet. Some people are resistant." "That's expected," Darren replied, flipping through one of the reports. "Change makes people uncomfortable. It forces them to confront things they've ignored for a long time." Sheila hesitated, then added, "Mike's trying. I can see that, but he's struggling more than the others." Darren leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. "He will. This isn't just about behavior. It's about rewiring how we see the world. And that's never easy." Sheila gave him a curious look. "You've been keeping an eye on him, haven't you?" Darren smiled faintly. "I told you, Sheila. I've been watching everyone from the start." Sheila shook her head, still amazed by Darren's methodical approach. "You really don't miss anything, do you?" "Not when it matters," Darren replied quietly. By the end of the day, the building was beginning to settle into a new rhythm. Darren wandered through the halls, observing the subtle shifts in behavior, small moments of kindness, brief exchanges that would have gone unnoticed before. They weren't grand gestures, but they were real. And that, Darren knew, was how real change happened, bit by bit, moment by moment, until it became second nature. As he walked toward the lobby to leave for the evening, he spotted Mike at the front desk. This time, the interaction was different. Mike looked up, saw Darren approaching, and smiled, not out of obligation, but out of genuine recognition. "See you tomorrow, Darren," Mike said, his tone easy and respectful. Darren gave him a nod. "See you, Mike?" It was a simple exchange. Nothing dramatic, nothing forced, but it meant everything. As Darren stepped out into the cool evening air, he glanced back at the building, his heart light with quiet satisfaction. This wasn't just a property anymore. It was becoming what he'd envisioned from the start, a place where people mattered, where every interaction counted. And tomorrow? Tomorrow, they'd keep building. Months passed, and the building felt different, alive with new energy. What had started as awkward, forced efforts to follow the training slowly evolved into genuine behavior. Employees began treating everyone with the same courtesy, regardless of title or appearance. Darren's vision was taking root, and although the shift wasn't perfect, it was progress. Small, consistent acts of respect had become a habit. Mike, now the face of the front desk, was the most noticeable transformation. His once defensive demeanor had softened, replaced by an easygoing presence. He greeted visitors warmly, no longer scanning them with suspicion, but offering genuine help. And the change wasn't lost on the people around him. One rainy afternoon, Mike was at his post when he noticed a young man standing nervously at the entrance. The man wore an old jacket, clutching a bag as if it held everything he owned. A year ago, Mike might have dismissed him as someone who didn't belong. But now he saw things differently. Mike gave the man a small nod. "Need any help, buddy?" The man hesitated, clearly expecting to be turned away. "Yeah, I'm supposed to meet someone about a job interview, but I think I came in the wrong entrance." Mike smiled. "No problem. You're in the right place. Just head down the hall to the elevator's third floor. If you need anything else, let me know." The man's shoulders relaxed, the tension melting away. "Thanks, really." As the man disappeared toward the elevators, Mike leaned back in his chair with a quiet sense of satisfaction. It wasn't a grand moment, but it was exactly the kind Darren had talked about. Those small, everyday interactions that make people feel seen. That same afternoon, Darren returned to the building for a final meeting with Sheila. As he stepped through the lobby, he noticed Mike at the desk, chatting comfortably with a delivery driver. When Mike spotted Darren, he gave a respectful nod and a genuine smile. "Afternoon, Darren," Mike said, his tone easy and familiar. "Afternoon, Mike." Darren returned the smile, pausing briefly. "How's it going?" Mike shrugged lightly. "Not bad. Just trying to keep the place running smooth." "You're doing a good job," Darren said. "I've noticed." Mike's grin widened, but there was no trace of the insecurity that had once haunted him. "Appreciate it, boss." Darren gave him a nod of approval and continued toward the elevators. As he rode up to the third floor, he reflected on the subtle but profound changes that had taken place. What had started as a tense, uncomfortable challenge had grown into something meaningful, a new culture, built not with rules or policies, but with intention and care. In the conference room, Sheila was waiting for Darren with a stack of reports. As he entered, she gave him a knowing smile. "You're going to like what's in these," she said, handing him the top file. Darren flipped through the pages. Performance metrics, employee feedback surveys, and retention numbers all pointed to the same conclusion. Things were improving. Not just on the surface, but deeply. Employees felt valued. Staff turnover was down. The building was becoming a place where people wanted to work and stay. "Well done, Sheila," Darren said, closing the folder. "It's exactly what I hoped for." Sheila leaned back in her chair, a hint of pride in her eyes. "It wasn't easy, but I think we're finally getting there." Darren nodded. "It's not about getting there. It's about staying there. This kind of thing never really ends. It just evolves." Sheila smiled. "Spoken like a true leader." Darren gave a small laugh, standing to leave. "That's the plan." As Darren made his way back down to the lobby, he felt a quiet sense of closure. The building was in good hands now, with Sheila's steady leadership and employees like Mike who had embraced change. The transformation would continue even after Darren stepped away. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the city streets slick and glistening under the evening lights. Darren paused by the doors, taking one last look at the building. It no longer felt like just another business venture. It was a community, a place where every person, no matter who they were, mattered. And that, Darren knew, was the real success. As he turned to leave, Mike's voice called out from behind him. "Hey, Darren." Darren turned back, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah?" Mike gave him a quick, respectful salute, half playful, half sincere. "Thanks for not giving up on me." Darren's smile was warm, but his eyes carried the weight of everything unsaid. "You gave yourself the chance, Mike. I just made sure you had the space to take it." With that, Darren stepped out into the cool air, blending into the crowd of people moving through the city streets. He didn't need recognition or fanfare. The real reward was knowing that something good had taken root, and that, even in the smallest of ways, it would keep growing long after he was gone. And that was enough.